What most Americans don't realize is that this crisis didn't begin with tariffs or trade wars or even political rhetoric. It began with something far more fundamental: the quiet collapse of an assumption that has guided American foreign policy for decades. The assumption that allies, when pressed, will always blink first. For years, we told ourselves that Canada was the junior partner in North America's economic relationship: reliable, accommodating, ultimately dependent on American goodwill and market access. When General Motors decided to shut down its assembly plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, throwing over 1,000 workers into uncertainty, most observers expected the familiar script to play out. Canada would protest, negotiate, perhaps grieve publicly, but ultimately accept the outcome. That's how these things had always worked. What happened instead was something Washington genuinely didn't see coming. Canada didn't blink, it didn't accept. And in refusing to follow the script, it exposed how much of American leverage rests not on actual power, but on the assumption that power will never be tested. I want to walk you through what really happened here, because the surface story most people heard tells you almost nothing about the deeper institutional failure it represents. On the surface, this looked like another sad but familiar tale of globalization. A major corporation shuts down a plant, workers pay the price, governments issue statements, and life moves on. But if that's all you saw, you missed the most important shift in North American power dynamics in a generation. When GM announced it was closing CAMI assembly in Ingersoll, the company pointed to familiar justifications: weak demand, market conditions, the need to restructure its electric vehicle strategy, standard corporate language that treats economic decisions as natural forces like weather. But what made this different wasn't the closure itself. It was what came next. For years, both federal and provincial governments in Canada had supported GM with public money: subsidies, incentives, infrastructure support, all justified with the usual promises about securing jobs and positioning Canada in the future of manufacturing. Workers trusted those promises because they'd heard them from both the company and their own government. Communities organized their lives around them. Taxpayers became stakeholders whether they realized it or not. When GM pulled the plug, it wasn't just closing a plant, it was breaking what Canadians understood to be a social contract. A contract that said public support comes with public obligations. You don't take billions meant for long-term production and then quietly exit when the quarterly numbers stop looking perfect. Now, corporations have been doing exactly that for decades because governments rarely enforce consequences. The unspoken rule was that multinational corporations always held the upper hand. If pushed too hard, they could leave, and governments would blink first rather than face the economic disruption. Canada didn't blink. And that single decision to enforce consequences rather than absorb them quietly changed the entire dynamic of how economic pressure works in North America. What Ottawa did was both elegant and devastating. Instead of matching GM's corporate language with diplomatic protests, they moved to strip the company of key trade privileges that had allowed it to sell US-built vehicles into Canada without facing tariffs. Suddenly, cars that had crossed the border freely for years were hit with steep duties. Not symbolic penalties, not angry speeches, but real, immediate costs that landed directly on GM's balance sheet. The brilliance of this response lay in its mechanism. Trade privileges aren't gifts. They're conditional arrangements that lower costs for companies in exchange for economic activity, jobs, and investment within a country. When those conditions are violated, the privileges can be withdrawn. Ottawa didn't need to invent a new weapon. It just needed the political will to use the one it already had. From GM's perspective, this was a catastrophic miscalculation. The company had treated the Canadian market as an extension of the American one, assuming frictionless access would continue regardless of its production choices. When that assumption collapsed, the entire cost structure collapsed with it. Vehicles that made sense on a spreadsheet no longer did. Suddenly, the decision to abandon Canadian production didn't look like efficiency. It looked like a strategic error. But here's what you need to understand about why this matters far beyond one factory in Ontario. This wasn't just about punishing a corporation that broke its promises. It was about redefining the relationship between public investment and private profit. It was a test of whether modern democratic states are willing to defend workers and communities using the tools already at their disposal, or whether they'll continue pretending they're powerless in the face of corporate decisions. For decades, the North American auto industry had operated on a simple threat structure. Companies would say, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly, that investment was conditional. Jobs existed as long as governments stayed flexible, wages stayed contained, and subsidies stayed generous. If a country pushed too hard, production could always move somewhere else. That threat shaped policy long before any plant actually closed. In Canada, it meant governments often behaved less like regulators and more like junior partners, desperate to stay in the game. Public money flowed to private firms with limited strings attached because the alternative was framed as economic disaster. Over time, that logic hardened into habit. Corporations learned that commitments were flexible, but subsidies were reliable. What GM didn't account for was that Canada's policy framework had quietly changed. Tucked inside trade agreements and industrial policy was a mechanism designed to reward companies that maintained production in Canada and penalize those that didn't. It wasn't flashy, wasn't talked about much, but it existed, and crucially, it was enforceable. When Ottawa pulled that trigger, something profound shifted, not just in the immediate economics of the auto sector, but in the broader understanding of how power moves between corporations and democratic governments in a globalized economy. I've spent decades watching how American influence operates, and I can tell you that real power in international relations isn't about the capacity to impose costs. It's about the willingness to absorb them when principles are at stake. What Canada demonstrated in this moment was exactly that kind of principled resolve. They were willing to risk retaliation, to accept short-term disruption, to face criticism in order to defend the idea that agreements mean something. Washington, meanwhile, was operating from the opposite premise. It assumed that Canada's smaller size meant perpetual accommodation. That economic gravity alone guaranteed compliance. That pressure, when applied, would produce the desired result without meaningful resistance. That assumption was wrong, and being wrong about the character of your closest ally reveals something troubling about the quality of institutional thinking that guides American foreign policy. You see, the real lesson here isn't about trade mechanics or corporate behavior, it's about the erosion of American credibility with partners who have options. For years, Canadian policymakers had watched Washington's approach to alliance management become increasingly transactional, increasingly punitive, increasingly divorced from the mutual respect that had historically anchored the relationship. When you treat partnership as dependence, you create the conditions for partners to seek independence. When you assume compliance, you invite resistance. When you mistake size for leverage, you discover that leverage flows both ways. What makes Canada's response so strategically sophisticated is that it wasn't emotional, it wasn't theatrical, it was methodical enforcement of rules that already existed. By keeping the temperature low and the focus narrow, Ottawa preserved its credibility while exposing GM's miscalculation. They demonstrated that consequences for breaking agreements don't require drama, they just require consistency. The ripple effects of that demonstration are still spreading. Other automakers watched what happened when a government stopped treating enforcement as optional. They saw that Canada wasn't just making noise, but changing the underlying economics of non-compliance. And they adjusted their strategies accordingly. That's how power actually shifts in modern capitalism, not through speeches or summits, but through who can impose costs and who absorbs them. Canada proved it could impose costs. GM discovered it couldn't avoid them, and everyone else in the industry learned that the old rules about corporate mobility might not be as reliable as they'd assumed. But while boardrooms recalculated their risk assessments, the human dimension of this story remained front and center. For workers at that plant, a shutdown isn't an abstract policy adjustment. It's a rupture that affects paychecks, benefits, futures built around stable employment. You can't spreadsheet that away. What resonated so deeply about the government's response wasn't that it fixed everything immediately, but that it signaled something workers rarely hear from those in power. that their labor matters, that public investment isn't a one-way transfer upward, and that when commitments are broken, someone is willing to step in and enforce accountability. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for American policymakers, because once you demonstrate that enforcement is possible, you implicitly admit that past inaction was a choice. That doesn't mean every shutdown could have been prevented, but it does mean that governments have often underestimated their own leverage or chosen not to use it. The deeper pattern here is one I've observed throughout decades of watching American institutional behavior. We've become so accustomed to thinking of market outcomes as natural phenomena that we've forgotten markets are structured environments shaped by policy, by law, and by political choices. When those choices consistently favor capital mobility over community stability, you shouldn't be surprised when capital chooses mobility. What Canada's response reminds us is that sovereignty in a globalized economy doesn't require isolation or protectionism. It requires enforcement. It requires the willingness to say that participation in shared markets comes with responsibilities, not just privileges. And it requires the institutional capacity to make that principle stick when it's tested. From a geopolitical perspective, this moment also signals something broader about the shifting dynamics of North American power. For too long, American foreign policy has operated under the assumption that the United States sets the terms and smaller partners adapt. What we're seeing now is a different model emerging, where allies assert their own interests with quiet confidence rather than deferent accommodation. This isn't anti-American, it's post-American in the sense that it doesn't organize itself around American preferences as the default starting point. Canada's response to GM wasn't designed to embarrass Washington or score ideological points. It was designed to protect Canadian workers and enforce Canadian policy. The fact that this created discomfort in corporate boardrooms and policy circles south of the border wasn't the goal. It was simply a consequence of treating sovereignty seriously. History shows us that declining powers often misinterpret this kind of principled independence as defiance or ingratitude. But what it actually represents is the natural adjustment of relationships that had become unbalanced. When the United States was the overwhelmingly dominant economic force in North America, asymmetric accommodation made sense for Canada. As that dominance has become less overwhelming, more symmetric relationships become both possible and necessary. The tragedy, from an American perspective, is that this adjustment didn't have to be adversarial. A more self-aware approach to alliance management would have recognized Canada's growing capacity for independent action and worked to channel that capacity into shared objectives. Instead, we got assumptions about permanent dependence that proved both wrong and counterproductive. What I find most troubling about Washington's surprise at Canada's resolve is what it reveals about the quality of institutional memory in American foreign policy. Anyone who has studied Canadian political culture seriously knows that beneath the reputation for politeness lies a fierce commitment to sovereignty that has deep historical roots. From the War of 1812 through the Cold War, Canada has repeatedly demonstrated that it will defend its interests when pushed too hard, regardless of the size differential with the United States. The fact that this character trait caught American policymakers off guard suggests a troubling superficiality in how we understand our most important bilateral relationship. When your assumptions about an ally's behavior prove wrong, the problem isn't with the ally, it's with the assumptions. As we look ahead, the lesson isn't that Canada has become hostile to American interests. It's that Canada has become more selective about which American interests it's willing to accommodate. That selectivity is based on reciprocity, respect, and mutual benefit rather than simple deference to American size and proximity. For American institutional leadership, this represents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that the era of automatic Canadian accommodation is over. Future cooperation will need to be earned through genuine partnership rather than assumed through geographical proximity. The opportunity is that genuine partnerships, while more demanding to maintain, tend to be more durable and productive than relationships based on dependence. What the GM episode ultimately demonstrates is that power in the modern international system flows not to those who can demand the most, but to those who can deliver the most reliable cooperation over time. Canada's measured response to corporate betrayal enhanced its credibility as a partner for any actor seeking predictable, principled engagement. America's surprise at that response diminished its credibility as a partner capable of understanding the legitimate interests of others. The quiet revolution in Canadian assertiveness isn't anti American, but it is post deferential. And learning to work effectively in a post deferential North America may be one of the most important institutional adaptations American foreign policy will need to make in the coming decade. History rarely punishes nations for losing power. It punishes them for refusing to recognize when the terms of power have fundamentally changed.